Hi, my name is Holly, and today I will be presenting my capstone presentation titled Bridging the Credibility Gap, Aligning External DEI Commitments with Internal Workforce Equity Practices. This work emerges from a three-part inquiry. First, examining the persistent misalignment between public diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments and internal organizational realities. Second, analyzing historical, political, and organizational factors that shape this misalignment. And third, proposing a research informed framework and set of tools designed to support credible, sustainable equity work. The credibility gap refers to the measurable disconnect between what organizations communicate externally about their DEI efforts and the lived experiences of their employees internally. The literature consistently shows that DEI credibility is determined not by public statements or branding, but by daily employee experiences of fairness and inclusion. This gap produces a pattern of organizational skepticism, diminished trust, and in many cases, withdrawal from DEI efforts, especially among historically marginalized employees. In essence, it signifies a breakdown between symbolic DEI and structural DEI. A wide body of research demonstrates that credibility is foundational to employee belonging, psychological safety, and engagement. When employees observe contradictions between organizational rhetoric and organizational practice, they interpret DEI as performative. This interpretive process matters because it shapes whether employees believe their organization is committed to equity or merely invested in its image. Across studies, credibility emerges as a relational construct rooted in consistency, transparency, and accountability. The purpose of this capstone is threefold. First, to synthesize existing research on DEI misalignment and identify the primary drivers of the credibility gap. Second, to analyze the historical, political, and organizational context that has contributed to the current state of DEI practice. And third, to design a three-phase integration framework and two practical tools that organizations can use to align their internal systems with their external commitments. Together, these components aim to advance a more evidence-based, sustainable model of DEI practice. Historically, DEI in the United States began with a compliance orientation through the Civil Rights Act and the establishment of the EEOC. Early efforts centered on legal adherence rather than cultural or structural transformation. In the 1990s, the emergence of the business case reframed DEI as a strategic advantage. While this broadened organizational interest, it also ushered in standardized programs, often insufficiently linked to structural change, and reinforced superficial approaches to equity. By the 2010s, discourse shifted towards representation, identity, and intersectionality. Yet, even with this expanded language, many organizations continue to implement only short term or symbolic initiatives without actually disrupting the underlying systems. However, the 2020 racial justice uprisings catalyzed widespread DEI commitments across sectors. Organizations produced public statements, formed DEI task forces, and created new DEI leadership roles. However, many lacked the infrastructure to carry these commitments forward. Simultaneously, digital misinformation and political backlash intensified, leading to increased scrutiny of DEI programs, policy restrictions, and in some regions, reduced organizational investment in equity work. This context further widened the credibility gap and complicated alignment efforts. The literature identifies several organizational contributors to the credibility gap: inconsistent leadership behavior, lack of distributed accountability, cultural norms that contradict equity statements, and so on. These factors collectively influence how employees interpret DEI and whether they experience the organization as trustworthy. To address these challenges, this project proposes a three-phase DEI integration framework grounded in shared equity leadership, equity-minded inquiry, and organizational learning. The framework consists of Phase 1, assessment and root cause analysis, Phase 2, co-design and integration, and finally, in Phase 3, implementation, accountability, and continuous learning. It is structured to move organizations from awareness to collaborative solution building, all the way to into internalization. Phase 1 begins with an equity-minded assessment of internal structures, systems, and workforce experiences. This includes the use of disaggregated data to examine patterns in hiring, pay, advancement, climate, and retention. The purpose is not only to identify disparities, but to develop a root cause understanding of the conditions that sustain them. Listening sessions, story-based inquiry, and cross-role analysis support this effort and ensure that both quantitative and qualitative data shape the findings. In Phase 2, the focus shifts to collaboratively designing interventions that directly address causes identified in Phase 1. Drawing on co-design principles and shared equity leadership, this phase repositions employees as partners in the design of equitable systems rather than as recipients of top-down solutions. Interventions are piloted, refined, and intentionally linked to measurable change pathways. This ensures that organizations design for depth, not just visibility. Phase 3 involves institutionalizing interventions through formal policy, leadership routines, resource allocation, and ongoing monitoring. Key practices include embedding equity experiences into job roles, distributing accountability across levels, and so on. This phrase frames equity as an ongoing organizational learning process rather than a one-time initiative. The first practical tool developed in this project, the Equity-Minded Alignment Scorecard, supports Phase 1 by providing a structured diagnostic assessment across 4 domains. First, external commitments and transparency, then internal structures and systems, followed by employee experiences and culture, and finally, outcomes and equity impact. The scorecard helps organizations visualize misalignment and prioritize areas requiring further inquiry. The second tool, the DEI Credibility Gap Action Planning Tool, operationalizes Phase 2 and 3. It guides organizations through 5 steps. Define the alignment gap, conduct root cause analysis, co-design interventions, pilot and refine them, and then finally institutionalize effective solutions. This tool ensures that interventions are tied to evidence, co-created, and reinforced through policy and practice rather than isolated programming. Several insights have emerged. Credibility is created through alignment between internal systems and external commitments, not through statements alone. Employees' perception of fairness and transparency are among the strongest predictors of DEI credibility. Sustainable change requires distributed leadership, evidence use, and shared accountability. And co-design strengthens both the quality of the intervention and the legitimacy of DEI efforts in the eyes of the employees. Across all findings, the relationship between structural reform and relational trust is central. This project argues that the credibility gap is not a communication problem. It is a structural one. It reflects deeper tensions between organizational aspirations and organizational realities. The proposed framework and tools aim to support organizations in shifting from symbolic equity efforts to practices that are evidence-informed, collaborative, and integrated into the fabric of organizational life. Ultimately, credibility grows when actions consistently reflect communications. When organizations align their external narratives with internal systems, they strengthen not only trust and belonging, but also the conditions for long-term transformative DEI work. Thank you for watching my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.